All right, are we good to go? Okay, awesome. Well, thanks everyone for joining today's talk on how to deprecate a feature the right way. I'd actually like to open up with a quick question, just simply by show of hands. How many of you have ever tried to use a feature, a service, maybe an endpoint that didn't behave exactly like you might have expected it to? No way. Really? Yeah, not a shocker, right? So that's the basis for today's talk. Maybe you run into a situation that sounds a little bit like this. You log onto your computer on a Monday morning. Maybe you had an awesome weekend. You just want work to go as planned. You go to access the same piece of software that you use every week, except suddenly this Monday morning, you run into something like this. You notice that something's not working. You've changed absolutely nothing on your end. And some service is throwing 500 errors, something crazy like that. You and your team might spend the next 2 hours trying to debug this, only to find out that actually a dependent service that you rely on has been deprecated, but you were not aware of this. How frustrating is this? It's super frustrating, definitely, but it's also entirely avoidable. So in the next 40 to 60 minutes, I'm going to walk us through how to deprecate a feature the right way and try to avoid some of the pitfalls of these frustrating situations. First, just a little bit about me. My name is Will Bishop. I'm a senior developer advocate at Miro. For those of you who might not be familiar with Miro, it's an online visual collaboration platform that allows you to basically use like a whiteboard as a service. I work specifically on our developer platform, which extends the power of Miro via our APIs and our SDKs. And more specifically, I'm really passionate about REST APIs and how we can interconnect the web and all sorts of stuff like that. So I've been through several deprecations of my own at organizations like Miro, Zoom, Meetup, and a few others over the better half of the last decade. So I'm really excited to touch on some of these themes with you all today and share some of my learnings over the years. So we'll obviously talk about deprecation. What is it? Why do we do it? I'll talk a lot about trust, whether it's for end users or developers, whoever's using a feature or service. We'll talk about versioning. This is really intertwined with deprecation, which you might expect. We'll obviously talk about executing on a strategy for deprecating a feature the right way with some concrete examples. And we'll touch on retirement as well, which is what any good deprecation policy ultimately aims to achieve. So let's move right into it. So what is deprecation? So I think Twitter does a really good job, or well, did, depending on your persuasion, a good job of defining deprecation because it's really clear, it's really simple, it's really concise. They say that deprecation is simply, something's no longer officially recommended. If you find a bug or something, don't exactly expect them to fix it. And they define retirement as actually, this feature is no longer accessible, it's no longer viable to use. So it's really important to be clear on how you're going to define deprecation versus retirement up front, because if you're not clear on how you're defining this phase of end of life for your services or your APIs, whatever it might be, you certainly can't expect end users or developers who are looking at your policies or working with your services to be clear either. So there's a lot of different terms out there for end of life. You'll see this referred to as sunsetting, decommissioning, retiring. All this aside, we're really looking at two phases. The first phase, which we'll define deprecation as something's no longer recommended for use. We're not going to be pouring new resources into it. And the second phase of retirement, which is, this is not possible to be used anymore. It's been completely decommissioned. So, we have a sense of what we agree on for these definitions, but why do we actually deprecate things in the first place? Well, any healthy service or feature, API, whatever it might be, should obviously be evolving and expanding its capabilities over time. And this is exactly where deprecation comes in, because the things that are in your software today could very well be outdated, irrelevant, perhaps not even important to your product in the coming years, coming months. And we need a way to handle these older versions and offload the time, the resources, the money that we're spending on maintaining things that may no longer be necessary. And so, now that we understand what deprecation is and why we do it, how do we actually achieve these goals? Well, it all starts with trust. The trust of end users, if it's a simple feature in your UI, or the trust of developers, if it's an API or a service that you're offering externally. This is the single biggest risk to identify upfront when deprecating a feature. Why, you might ask, or maybe you don't ask, but I'll tell you anyways. And it's because you're making a formal commitment, down on paper, so to speak, that your APIs or your feature is going to function exactly how you say it will, or it'll stop functioning when you say it will. And end users and developers may actually rely on your services as the backbone of their own critical infrastructure. In the example up front, you go to access the same piece of software you use every week, but suddenly it's not working for you because of some dependent service. This is exactly what we want to avoid. More succinctly, trust is directly tied to business impact for the people who are relying on your software. So how do we avoid this risk? Well, we avoid this risk by avoiding each of these things. So unclear timelines, that might be familiar to all of us. Hearing something like, oh, we'll get to that in Q3, or, oh yeah, we're aware that we need to be ready to deprecate that, but we'll talk about it in the new year. This might look like a lack of internal consensus. So, droves of meetings with no concrete takeaways, no action items, not paying attention to shifting business priorities, all sorts of things. And this might look like undocumented behavior. So, product or engineering changes that were not communicated externally. So it's really important to call these out because a strategy for deprecating a feature the right way should really be thinking about maintaining this trust you've built with your end users and developers throughout your product lifecycle. Outside of feature sets, capabilities, the services you offer in an API or an SDK, trust in a product is one of the #1 reasons that an individual will choose to work with your product over others. And this relies on us making clear, actionable commitments to our end users and anticipating their needs and how a deprecation is actually going to affect them in their day-to-day work. It's really important to get this right on the first shot because you really only get one shot. If your strategy includes any of those ambiguities or bad ideas that we were just talking about, that's when end users or developers are going to start losing trust in your product. Being hyper-aware of these risks is actually, in many ways, just as important as knowing what success looks like. If your deprecation goes off without a hitch, then you should hear nothing about it. You shouldn't hear from end users. You shouldn't hear from developers. There should be very little noise because that means everything went according to plan. But if your deprecation doesn't have a strategy behind it, unclear timelines, you're almost certain to hear about it. You're going to hear about it from people on social media, people in your communities. All it takes is one person with a bad experience to kind of light that wildfire that can really start disintegrating that trust that you've built. So what concrete steps can we do to ensure that this doesn't happen? So let's talk about execution. Up until this point, I've talked somewhat hypothetically about why it's important, good versus bad, but let's get into a concrete example with a small case study. And this case study starts with the assembly of our primary stakeholders. So while it's true of almost any strategic initiative within an organization that you have to work cross-functionally, I want to emphasize how important it is when it comes to deprecation because it touches all of these different groups. Product, engineering, customer success, possibly more or less depending on your organization. But you really also need one person dedicated to holding point on all of these parties to make sure that your deprecation strategy is holistic and takes into account all of these different facets. And more than that, it really needs to be somebody with true empathy. So if you are a developer product, this should be someone with an engineering background. This should be like a developer relations type of person, an engineer. If you are talking about a more general feature in your UI, this could be a product manager. It doesn't matter who it is. It just has to be somebody who understands how people use your product and how this is going to affect them. At Miro, we have a developer relations team, and my role was largely convening all these different groups and making sure that priorities were clear as we were developing a strategy for deprecating a platform, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But every organization looks a bit different, of course. This might be an engineering lead. This might be a product manager. these are the kinds of decisions you'll have to make. So what types of challenges should these individuals in this working group be thinking about? Well, these are what I'm going to call the big three. So these are, three main components to be thinking about upfront as a working group internally. And first is timelines. So, from an engineering and product perspective, when can we be certain, or as certain as possible, that whatever feature or version is going to replace our existing one is actually going to be ready? And from there, we can kind of start working backwards. So, okay, if this is when we expect our V2 of this existing feature to be ready, when do we need to have communications ready? When do we have to have a strategy, publicly posted, and kind of so on and so forth from there. Dependencies is the next thing. So are there limitations or dependencies that could alter this kind of tentative timeline that you have in your mind? You could say, okay, we think we're going to be ready to retire this feature or this endpoint in the spring of next year based off of what we've been talking about as a group. But what are the things that you're not thinking about? And that's a really difficult question to answer, right? Because you don't know what you don't know. But you have to take time, or you have to account for time that's going to eat up some of your timeline. So there's going to be things like shifting business priorities. There's going to be scrambling at the end to try and have parity between future versions. These are all sorts of things you should be thinking about as much as possible to include in your timeline, just as kind of like a general safety buffer, so to speak. And lastly, messaging. So this should be well-informed, acknowledge impact, and relay a really clear timeline, or as accurate as possible to customers. This, of course, should only come after these first 2 points have already been handled. So these are three big components to be thinking about internally. But there are outside influences as well that you should really be thinking about. So like any good plan, it's invaluable to know how others before us have achieved the same challenge or tackled the same challenge. This is especially important if you are a younger or less mature organization. Maybe you are a startup. Maybe you've never had to deprecate anything before. At Miro, we had a really good sense of what our deprecation needs were going to be. We had in-house experience with deprecations, so we kind of knew how to handle these types of things. But it didn't stop us from taking a moment to look at what others were doing, especially in our field. So this process should actually raise more questions. When we started looking at some of these big tech logos on the right-hand side of the screen, we started realizing we had questions we didn't even know we had. Like, okay, we know we need a deprecation policy, but should this be part of our terms of service? If we publish a public-facing deprecation policy, how related should it be to our versioning policy? Do we need to have a versioning policy at the same time? These are all questions that came up as we started looking at how other people were publicly sharing this information. This is to say that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. You're going to have to take what makes sense to you and your product. Things that are clearly not applicable, leave those out, of course. If you're an API, product or API as a service, you don't need to be taking, pointers or advice from something that's a completely, unrelated capability, of course. So with this in mind, let's take a look at a Miro case study, so how we handled this at Miro. And just for some context, we had what we will call a V1 developer platform, which we rebuilt from scratch to improve the developer experience, extend the capabilities of what people could build on Miro. And so we needed to come up with a deprecation policy to handle the offloading of our older platform as we introduced our new one. And I'll talk about this in a sec in the timeline on the next slide, but another thing we did was we tried to streamline our messaging so that when we released our new platform, we also at the same time were talking about deprecation of the old one so that we weren't sending out multiple messages about the same thing. So let's take a closer look. As I was saying before, we started by convening a working group and doing some initial exploration. And this over here on the left-hand side of the timeline is where we did all the work up front to get our best possible sense of what a future retirement date could be, based on discussions with product and engineering around feasibility, based on conversations with customer success around how much time we needed to give people that was reasonable. And this is how we landed on the retirement of Platform V1 over here on the right-hand side. Again, this is not an exact science, but we did as much as we could to inform that decision and then we reverse engineered this timeline from there. And what I want to call out here is before the retirement of platform v1, we have these buffer periods where you can see monitoring the adoption of v2 and our best effort at closing any future gaps. So these were some of those unknowns that we didn't know how long it would take, but we knew they were things we should be thinking about before we actually retire our existing platform. Prior to those kind of safety buffer moments, we have the announcement of our deprecation policy publicly and the launch of our new platform right around the same time. And then before that was all the work we've been talking about in terms of that working group and drafting communications, doing our due diligence and looking at how others handled this, and so forth. But I'll speak to this in a minute, but just note that retirement only occurs after this monitoring adoption and our best effort at feature parity. Because this is exactly where another risk lies when deprecating a feature. And that risk is deprecating a feature and retiring it prematurely. This is another place to have that end user trust or developer trust top of mind. Or in other words, honesty and transparency above everything else. So when end users or developers choose to leverage your product, they're putting their faith in more than just your software's capabilities. They're really putting their faith in your judgment calls and your decision making. At Miro, we stuck to our internal commitments, but we also kept this trust top of mind by communicating any changes in our timeline accordingly, and assuring developers that we weren't going to retire v1 until we were positive that everything could be accomplished in v2 that was already possible in v1. So Steve Jobs says this really well when he says, when you innovate, you make mistakes. It's best to get on with them quickly and get on and improving with your other innovations. And I think what I'm really getting at here is that developers, end users, whoever it might be, they appreciate it when you keep it real with them. We can have all these plans, but in reality, at the end of the day, we're not going to go and shut off critical infrastructure just because we had this plan. It can be really difficult to achieve certain things like feature parity, and you may not always get it 100%. It's much better to be transparent with your end users, who may be developers, and let them know, how you're handling this, rather than shutting off a feature on a given date just because that's when you said you would. So deprecating a feature the right way, really requires you to be realistic about each phase of end of life. And this means staying nimble and flexible where necessary as you're coming up with this strategy. And while deprecation is the first phase of end of life, this is followed by retirement. Deprecation is usually most of the battle, but nailing a retirement is also extremely important as well. You have to be looking at how services are performing. In our case, when we introduced a new suite of APIs to replace an existing one, we were looking at the generation of new client IDs for that new suite of APIs. We were looking at weekly API calls, making sure that our new platform was actually being adopted before we decided to push the big red button on our v1 platform. If expectations differ from reality, you may need to pivot. You may need to make some adjustments with your plan. And while this may go against what you might expect in a deprecation strategy, it's all about being realistic. You can't shut off critical infrastructure just because you made some internal commitments on saying this was the date when we're going to retire something. You have to use your head, and you have to be able to be checking in on these types of progress. It's a balance. It's a balance between developer focus or end user focus and these commitments that you've made internally as part of your planning. What does this look like in practice? Well, for us at Miro, moving from one platform to another, this looked like keeping our history of proactive communication with our developers at the forefront. It meant holding our engineering and product teams accountable to deliver key features that needed to be included in our v2 platform. And it looked like committing to our best effort at feature parity before we even thought about executing on a retirement. So now I'll cut to kind of the public deprecation policy that we came up with at Miro, which really grounds the strategy that we've taken. And there's a few different components that I want to call out specifically. But there's three that I think are the most important. The first is a concrete timeline. So we came up with a 6 months deprecation period for our V1 platform based on internal conversations with product and engineering, as well as insights from our customer success org and other industry best practices. Next is a formal commitment. It says here to developers, but maybe your product is really for end users. You just need to let them know that they're going to have the resources and the time that they need to make this adjustment as you release new features. This might look like migration guides or reference comparisons for an API or an SDK, just anything that's going to make their lives easier after you deprecate something. And next, a clear definition of deprecation versus retirement. So this goes back to what we said in the beginning, which is that you need to be clear about how you're defining these, because there's a lot of different terms out there. It should be really clear to developers or end users looking at your documentation that this is exactly what to expect at each phase of end of life. But the buck does not stop here with a good deprecation policy. In fact, deprecating a feature the right way means looking at it really holistically and building in certain practices into your product lifecycle from the get-go. It's really heavily reliant on other processes in your software development, like versioning, for instance. So when talking about how to deprecate a feature the right way, you want to take that holistic view and understand just how intertwined deprecation and versioning strategies should be. So you might recall when I opened up this talk earlier, I talked about how any healthy feature or service should be constantly evolving, right? We touched on this from a high level, but now I want to dig into it just a little bit deeper from the lens of versioning. So using our original example, let's take a look into a hypothetical timeline of feature versions. So we can pretend that we're talking about maybe a brand new API endpoint, a shiny new object for our developers to build really cool things on our platform. So in the spring of 2022, we release version 1.0.0, and it does things well enough. It's kind of an MVP model. And then we add some feature enhancements, maybe some optional parameters, things to extend these capabilities a bit more. And that's when we release version 1.1.0 with some minor updates in the fall. And there's no breaking changes there. But then as time goes on, we realize in the new year, actually, we need to kind of overhaul some of the work we've done already, maybe redesign the JSON structure for our API, redo some nesting, all sorts of breaking changes. So we release 2.0.0 in the new year. And this brings me right back to my original point of how deprecation is so involved in this versioning strategy, because we now need a way to handle this version 1.0.0, which has become way less relevant to us now that we offer this v2.0.0. And this is really actually an example of some basic semantic versioning. So I'm sure a lot of us are probably quite familiar with what semantic versioning looks like, but in case you aren't, we'll just do a quick crash course here, and I'll call out kind of the 3 core facets of semantic versioning. So first, you have a major version reserved for breaking changes. That's our 2.0.0 in the hypothetical situation we were just talking about. Then you have a minor version. So that is backwards compatible, typically for future enhancements, maybe like optional parameters in an API, nothing that's going to break anything, but usually for the better. And then we have our patch version, so that would be like 1.1.2 or something. And that is to bring a bug or something back to its original intended behavior. So you are fixing something, but it's technically backwards compatible because it wasn't supposed to behave in that way in the first place. So this is kind of just very high-level semantic versioning for us, but I bring it up because this is a very popular standard for versioning, and versioning itself is such an important part of being able to deprecate something the right way when the time comes. All right, so now that we know how this is all related, let's take a closer look at what a good versioning policy might look like. And for this, I'll use an example that I think we're all probably familiar with, which is GitHub. And I'll talk specifically about the REST API. So despite not following a strict example of semantic versioning in this particular case, I still think GitHub does a really good job of how they document their REST API's versioning policy. And they do what I consider a good job of clearly defining the versioning strategy that they take, while also tying it back into deprecation for their public APIs. So what makes it so good? Well, there's a few different things, but first, their versioning follows a very easy to understand standard, which is that it is directly tied to the date when that version was released. It's very hard to mix that up. Second, they promise that breaking changes will never be introduced in a minor version, or in the case of GitHub, it's a little bit different, but that might include kind of their minor and patch versions in every subsequent version that they give. But this is just for an easy example for us. Third, they provide a clear list of how they define breaking changes and what those look like. But most importantly, they tie their versioning policy back to their deprecation strategy by referencing the support window for any previous versions of their APIs. They say 24 months or something like that. And it's these clear standards and the demonstrated relationship between versioning and deprecation in their documentation that I think provide a really great example of just how intertwined these policies are and how to deprecate a feature the right way. But let's not just take my word for it. Let's get our hands a little dirty. So audience participation, everyone's favorite thing, right? I promise this won't be too bad. But if you're interested, you can join the Slido. And we've got a few scenarios that I will call out for us. And we'll see what everyone thinks. So I'll open this up right now. Got some conference Wi-Fi here, so let's give it a sec. All right, so here's scenario one. I think you all should have access to the Slido now. I'll give you a moment to read the question here. And this one is a bit of a trick question, perhaps, but a new request body parameter is added to an existing API endpoint. Would this require a new major version? Based off of what we were just talking about, the answer is actually kind of that it depends. But I'll give everyone a second. So it looks like, yeah, everyone seems to be on the right track. We've got about 80% of you saying that the answer is yes. And that's exactly right. So if this parameter that was added was required, then this would absolutely require a new major version, because that's a breaking change. People who did not have that parameter in the past and everything worked out as expected, if the next morning they wake up and a parameter they're not including is required, it's going to break their integration despite them making no changes on their end. If that was optional, then this would not require a new major version. That could be handled with a minor version. So this is just another example of some semantic versioning. All right, let's go to the next one here. So scenario two, a response field in an API endpoint is renamed. All right, it looks like we've got a lot of yeses here, and that's correct. If a field name is changed in an API response, that would break existing integrations who weren't expecting that new name. So yes, that would require a new major version. All right, two more here. So scenario three, in this edition of do we need a new major version? An operation or a method is removed from an SDK. So do we need a new major version? I think you're all pretty much experts in this room today. The answer is yes. So removing a method that could break existing applications, relying on that SDK, yes, a new major version would be required in this instance. All right, then we've got one more for you guys. In this last edition of Do We Need a New Version, let's pretend that a bug that caused a documented field in an API to sporadically be missing from the API response, let's say that's fixed. Does this require a new major version? give everyone just a moment there. All right, looks like someone just changed their answer. So actually, no, this does not require a new major version because this would be a patch, essentially, not needed to overhaul anything, basically taking something back to its originally intended behavior. So all this to say that deprecating a feature the right way is not something that can happen in a silo, and it's not something that can happen overnight. It's actually rather something that is a process. So all of this nonsense about semantic versioning and versioning itself, deprecation, how they're all kind of intertangled, the reason I'm harping on this is because deprecating a feature the right way is really difficult to do without having a holistic view. It's really difficult to have a very specific viewpoint on a certain part of a deprecation. Maybe you're just looking at the technical side of it. Oh, well, this can be done in this version, so it's not a big deal. But you have to be looking at messaging. You have to be looking at how you're versioning things in your product lifecycle. But more than that, it's a process that relies on these 4 things. So if you remember nothing else from today's talk, I think these are the 4 things that I would want to drive home for you, which is that deprecating a feature the right way requires you to take a cross-functional approach to the strategy, the planning, and the execution of bringing a feature to end of life. It requires that you keep end users, developers, partners, whoever it might be, at the heart of what you're coming up with. It requires putting in the time and resources up front, so not waiting till the 11th hour to come up with hasty messaging or not really have a fully baked strategy. And really important, it relies on having a clear versioning strategy throughout your feature's full product lifecycle, because this is going to help you actually achieve deprecation in the way that makes the most sense. So, as I've talked about, strategy, deprecation, versioning, it's all intertwined, and it's difficult to succeed at one without the other. So if you're able to honor each of these parts of the process, then you can rest assured that you've set yourself up in the best way possible to be able to deprecate a feature the right way when the time comes. And that's all I've got for you guys. So here I've got some resources for specifically APIs, if you're interested in reading a bit more about how other companies handle their deprecations. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Happy to chat more about this subject. But ultimately, I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, if you have any questions, there's a mic here as well. Thanks.
Do we have to use the mic?
No, feel free to just, yeah.
How often have you seen like somebody has a pretty strict deprecation and retirement policy, but I know you mentioned like if you have that good trust, you won't necessarily hear a lot of things go well, but that's not always accurate, right? If somebody's like, we don't ever want to see this go away. How often do you see someone that has a really good policy kind of backtrack because the blowback is too large, and kind of how do they handle that?
Yeah, it's a good question. He asked, for those of you on the video, how often have you seen somebody who has a really clear deprecation and retirement policy actually shift gears if there's blowback as to some unexpected changes? It's a good question. So actually, even at Miro, we are still waiting to retire our V1 platform that I was talking about earlier. We haven't gotten any blowback or anything, but it's more of a self-awareness type of thing of, okay, we know there are certain things we hoped to have by now in our next version that we don't have in our, it's not there yet. So we're actually still waiting to retire our V1 platform. But especially when you look at like larger organizations, like when I worked at Zoom, or if you're thinking of other like larger tech companies, sometimes they will take years to deprecate something. And I think that's more the standard depending on the level of sophistication of your suite of APIs, your SDKs, whatever it might be. I think oftentimes you are going to see situations where people might have to backtrack. But one of the points I wanted to drive home today was you can avoid that by giving these little updates along the way. And instead of having a forest fire to deal with, maybe you're just putting out little brush fires. Good question. Yeah.
Do you find that developers or non-technical end users are more resistant to change?
That's a good question. She asked, do you find developers or like non-technical end users are usually more resistant to change when you deprecate features? I might be a little biased because I work mostly with developers. But I would say developers, if something works, there's often no need to change something, right? Or at least that can be a mindset, which can be difficult to move past. But when it comes to people who are working with features in the UI, it's also kind of its own beast. You've got way more different types of personalities using something. You've got people in all sorts of different roles, especially in schools or things like that, enterprise software. You've got whole school systems or classrooms depending on something that might be going away. And that itself could take years to work through, which is why a lot of enterprise SaaS companies will take, as I was saying, like years to deprecate something. So it depends. But I guess my answer is, based on the people I work with, I think, yeah, it's kind of a moving target. Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. And enjoy the rest of the conference.